You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits in the world at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galenko. How you doing, Billy?
Great. Fresh off the weekend in Santa Barbara, actually, and got to go do a couple of tastings up there and went to a wedding.
Nice. Did you see any of our friends down there?
No friends, but I did get to taste it on Melville, which I'd wanted to for a long time. A lot of the people we've had on the podcast have recommended, and I haven't really had many of their wines. So that was cool. And then I also tasted in Solvang itself, which is a small town in Santa Barbara County, at Sevtap Winery. It was basically this little hole in the wall. And this guy buys fruit from like nearby, but he's like super passionate about pruning and making wine of like old world essence. So I walked in, everything was from 2019 that he was tasting at the time. And he was just super passionate to get wine nerdy. So that was a really fun little surprise for me.
Good wines too?
Yeah, a lot of low ABV, really balanced, bright acid. Definitely an old world style. Even the Riesling that he had that was supposedly from a warmer part of the county had a little bit of that like petrol, like around the nose. You almost would have never guessed it was from California. I ended up leaving with a 12.5% Malbec and a Sauvignon Blanc that just had an interesting density of like concentration of flavor as well as like linear acid. It was really cool stuff. And it was 2019, both of them.
So reds and whites.
Yeah, but both under 13% alcohol.
Yeah, nice. That sounds fun. I did not get to travel to any tastings this past weekend. I've been drinking a little bit more wine. I think I had 3 Australian wines in my cellar, and I drank all 3 of them over the last 10 days, or opened all 3 of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about those on a later episode. But yeah, it's just funny because I never drink Australian wines, really. It's just not a country that I buy a lot of wine from, which is fine. But I feel like I had everything Australian open this past weekend.
Well, if you guys haven't listened yet, go back to listen to our episode with Jane Lopez on how to drink Australian. Since working at Vintage there, I think most of the Australian wines, the top tier, most Americans don't really know much about them, and most of them are criminally underrated. So you should go check them out. All right, the news for this week, now that we'll pivot over there from Australian wine. Australian has Tasmanian sparkling, which I love. So we'll pivot over to another sparkling wine, champagne. The article for this week from our news is called 10 Style Trends in Champagne. This was an article that I found from the drinks business last week from their Champagne Masters. One of their reporters went and basically pulled 10 observations he had from tasting through champagnes that he had. And I figured we would talk about a couple, each of us, of our highlights or our main takeaways from this article. And for me, the main thing was, one, he led with sugarless champagne can be outstanding. And that's basically no or low dosage. I was telling you a little bit offline that when I was in Europe, I actually didn't realize, I thought no dosage or Brut Nature wines were becoming like more and more popular and that they were considered like very cool. I didn't realize there was like an older class of champagne collectors or people who really thought that a certain level of dosage meant quality. I didn't know some people had actually looked at low or no dosage as not as good. So the fact that he's needing to state that these can be outstanding was interesting to me. But I guess as everything gets riper, it is becoming more and more accepted that they can make a great champagne without adding a dosage at the end.
Yeah, ultimately, all of these things, warmer vintages, riper harvests, more use of oak, which they talk about in the article. Just, yeah, fuller wines, more dense, more complex. And it seems like that is happening across the range of champagne at all price points. So I'm expecting quote unquote, entry level champagne to be more expensive, but better quality. So I guess if you're already paying $50, $60, might as well pay $70.
I think you hit a lot of those same things that I found interesting on the nose, aside from the dosage, is as I'm tasting more of these and studying and trying to figure out based on what's in the glass, like what a wine tastes like and how it was made. I think it's really interesting to see the different layers and tools I guess champagne has nowadays, like trying to identify if a wine was a base wine for the champagne was vinified in oak, if it was fermented in oak and aged in oak, was it just aged? What is that doing to the mouthfeel? And then same with just the phenolics that are coming from the skin. As champagne's getting riper and riper, I feel like champagne makers have so many more tools in their toolbox to make really interesting wines. I've had a few champagne, I guess, experts tell me in the past few years that it's one of the best times to be drinking champagne because they think they're the most interesting in quality that they've ever been, because it used to have to be you'd wait for all these years just to get one really good harvest that was ripe enough, maybe to ripen the red grapes well enough. So I think it's a really good time. I'm wondering if we're close to that tipping over, like we had with Matthew Bicart last year, where he was mentioning the time that people are aging their vintage cuvées is getting shorter and shorter, and then the heat's really impacting the style of the wines. We might be at one of those inflection points where maybe we're moving on from the most interesting era ever to a whole new era. But yeah, we'll see. I think it's definitely exciting times. Check out more of this guy's points on the article. It was Patrick Schmidt, and the article is on our Vint Marketplace news from last week.
Very good. Well, I'm excited about our guests today. Actually, it's funny. We've been trying to chase down the folks at Beaux Frères for like months and months, actually a couple of years. We finally got back in touch with Chris and Mikey over there. And it's great to have Mike Etzel on the podcast today to share about their project in Ribbon Ridge, the Willamette Valley. They're a Pinot Noir house, as you'll talk about. They're making a little bit of Chardonnay, which we're super excited about. And I actually was able to get my hands on some, just got delivered the other day. So yeah, Billy and I, one of the few places that Billy and I have got to visit together. We spent some time out in Oregon. And yeah, I was super excited for this one.
Yeah, we got to visit, like you said, 3 years ago. We were thinking about trying to do something with them with Vint as like a collection model. We had considered an Oregon collection back in the day, stayed in touch over all these years. And it's been really cool to hear about what they've been doing. Like you were saying, working a little bit more with Chardonnay now. Some of the vineyards that were planted had been just planted when we were there, had come online since we've been there. So now they're producing wine, some of the first bottlings from that, which is really cool. And then Mikey also shares a bunch of plans for their expansion. They're doing some really intense work, building out their old pig barn, making it a really state-of-the-art winery. So it's cool that there's a wine like Beaux Frères that's so centered on place and is known for their quality, but now it's even just going to get better and better as they're able to hone even deeper and deeper into each of these plots and micro vinify and do everything. So I'm really excited for the future. And this conversation was really cool.
Yeah, special shout out to Beaux Frères for hosting us back when. It's a beautiful site. It really, like, when you drive up to the winery, I think, like, for me, I just felt farm is what I thought. And they've got pigs off on the hillside. And obviously, like you said, the old hog barn and the tasting room now. And they were starting to expand it back. Was it 2022 when we were there? Early 2022, I believe. And so, yeah, a lot has changed, obviously, in those 3 years. But again, great to have Mikey on. Encourage everyone to go check out their wines, some of the best Pinot Noir in Oregon, some of the best Pinot Noir in the United States. Before we get over to our interview today, remember, you can check out our online wine and spirits store at vintmarketplace.com. There you can find all of the cult classics, Bordeaux to Barolo, even some wines from the Willamette Valley, some of the largest selection of inventory in the U.S., and some of the most competitive pricing. Whether you're an enthusiast or a collector, the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar. So super excited now to introduce Mikey Etzel, second generation at Beaux Frères, president and technical director. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is one of the few properties actually that Billy and I have gotten to go to and taste together at was Beaux Frères. We got to do a trip up to Oregon a couple years ago and got to visit you guys up there. Yeah, really fun to have you on for the first time and looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. That was 3 years ago, and there's been some changes for sure, and much more to come with some of the facility oriented things of our actual vinification side, but the mantra hasn't changed. That's for sure.
I think when we were there last, you guys had just poured a new pad in the back and had some new, like you'd started to extend the facilities a little bit. So
Yeah.
that's cool. I think what struck me when we were there was that it's very much a farm, which is to me the most interesting facilities to tour, where it's like, hey, we're just up here growing grapes, basically.
That's right. We're a wine grower operation. What my mom and dad started when I was a year old. It was always based on the vines just up the hill from here. And it wasn't even their intention to make wine until they realized that they needed to make what their vision needed to work. So it evolved very naturally into the reconstruction of our pig barn into a makeshift winery. And fast forward, we can definitely go back more. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but fast forward, and it's been many iterations of renovations to this pig barn. You guys came at just one of the tiny ones, and there's a big one, real big one on the forefront, and several other changes to the property and some refocusing on the property that's happening right now. Yeah, I hope you will come back. One of the two of you are not too far away. We'll show you the time.
Well, in the spirit of stepping back a little bit, why don't you just give us the 1 minute intro on Beaux Frères and how your family got in? You mentioned a little bit, stumbled into the business a bit, but just the history of Beaux Frères there, and then we'll get in a little bit deeper.
Sure. 60 seconds. Let's see if we can do it. So, yeah.
I'll give you 90.
So my mother and father, they met on a short vagrancy from the East Coast to Colorado, where they met and married and actually birthed the three brothers, myself being the middle of the three sons of this impulsive couple. And my father had cut his teeth in the dairy farming world in the East Coast, but caught sort of along with my uncle, who is married to my father's sister, this passion for wine. My father was a wine salesman in Colorado for a distributor. He started picking up with my uncle some vibe and some news about some interesting things happening in Oregon. 1985, 1986. This was an era Oregon was just starting to make a little noise. They came out on vacation, my mother and father. I think I was still in the womb, the summer of 1985, to pick up some futures of Elk Cove, I think, and to visit the area, just see what this place is all about. A foreclosed penny ad for a foreclosed 88-acre farm was up, and they're like, let's go look at it on the way to Elk Cove. And then they just fell in love with it, and this kind of Green Acres mindset, and impulsively bought the farm, convinced my uncle to go in on it with them, and think they just felt that it was this great place to grow grapes and a family. And soon my father learned from the pioneers and from Dick Ponzi. He staged with Dick Ponzi for several years and learned some of the trade through that method. Also, with some connections from my uncle, my father lodged and learned a lot from some of the cutting edge domains in Burgundy, and planted this vineyard with his passion and his blood and sweat and tears, and with a program that was based on some things we could talk about maybe once we get into the winemaking and the wine growing philosophies. But it worked. This formula worked pretty beautifully with the namesake of Beaux Frères, meaning French for brother-in-law. It was this familial passion project from a couple people with great vision, in my opinion, and passion. And I grew up alongside it, and it's been quite a ride. And I just succeeded my father completely in this company 2 years ago. I'm sitting in his desk now. It's still weird, but that was way over 90 seconds, and I think it was maybe some history, but
no, that was perfect. Yeah. Just for those who don't know, your uncle is Robert Parker, so that was definitely and the Robert Parker, helpful in those wine connections for sure. And I think some people don't actually pick up on the brother-in-law thing and why that's important. But what I wanted to touch on was, one, did you always want to stay with the wine and follow up with your father's footsteps? And then two, can you share a little bit this is completely different, about Ribbon Ridge and where you are and how that area, especially even within the larger Willamette.
Sure. I was not very convinced in my youth that I was to be a winemaker. I witnessed the struggle that my father invested in making this thing become what it is. And the impact it had on my mother was strong in terms of that family struggle with my father putting so much into making this work. But certainly just this osmotic 3 brothers on this farm out in Yamhill County, very much Wild West, very much in my upbringing, the wine world was not what it is today. It was, who are you weird individuals in a very conservative, urban, rural, the whole urban, rural, this line, Portland out here, it's much closer now. And it's much different. It's more energy and niches and communal sense. Back then it was different. And so I didn't have this passion or this realization that the wine world was something that connects so much more than just this beautiful beverage that we make. So it took a different, like, coming to Jesus later when I was in college. Why is Ribbon Ridge quite special? It's the smallest sub-AVA of the Willamette Valley. It's this little toenail off of the larger Chehalem Mountains AVA. And so there's geological unique components to that, partially due to its being very small and consistent in this geological composition. But also, I think, in relation to the location that we're in and the proximity to some other features, I hate using the word nestled, and I will always try to avoid it. But this little toenail is just positioned at this interesting choke point. The Gaston Gap up north is this little mini valley just about 10 miles north of here as you go towards Gaston, the Coast Range. It was a choke point that carved when the Missoula floods came down and carved, scarified, and really made some very interesting impacts on the valley. It choked in this little floodplain right at the bottom of our winery here that deposited very rich sediment, and it's still a wetland preserve. It's one of the few. It also situated and scarified our hillsides to an extent, to about 350 to 400 feet elevation. And it was just an interesting position. We're tucked between Yamhill Carlton to the west. Dundee Hills is right in front of us, and the Chehalem Mountains is north to right, like an interesting central location that is based on marine sedimentary soils very consistently. We have comparative to Burgundy, we have very powerful soils, young, energetic soils that I think just are very harmonious to this wild component, this very green, lush atmosphere that you guys know, having visited, and this energy that comes from these vines that we grow are something that I think is unique and synonymous with the style of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay now. That energy and brightness shows through.
Something I remember about being in different producers in Willamette Valley in general is, and I don't know, maybe you do describe it as like the rolling hills of the region, but to me, it's like everything is very sharp and abrupt. Like every property we were at, it's like you get on the property and then it's walking straight uphill to the vineyards, like very steep, rapid elevation changes and such. And I remember that also being the case at your property as well. When you get back behind the refinished barn and you get up the hill, very steep elevation change. Is that like pretty consistent across the region, or is that just Ribbon Ridge, or that sort of was unique, or not unique, but drew your father? Yeah.
Yes, I think it was a profile of wine that drew him, that some of the pioneers were starting to make, but it's certainly a pronounced feature. Yes, due to the Missoula floods carving this valley, sediment-rich valley floor is not it is too powerful and rich for growing wine grapes versus the Napa foothills, for example. It's much different story. Some of the best vineyards are on those planar flat zones.
Yeah.
And it is certainly the Wild West. There's so much discovery happening still to understand the terroir of this fairly large swath that is the Willamette Valley. It's 60, 70 acres, primarily on the floor of the valley. There's some outcroppings of AVAs like Eel Amity and the Dundee Hills, or the west foothills of the Coast Range. There's so much exploration, and it's really interesting. And there's additional sub AVAs going in and all this. I don't have the bandwidth or the courage or the mental stamina to start to comment on the sub classification initiatives that our industry is taking. I think there's been in the last couple of years 3 or 4 additional AVAs going on, but it's great to see the exploration, and I think that's going to be contracting, sadly, in this current era with the struggles that our industry is facing.
I would like to ask, before we switch gears too much, about the property, but you are 3 vineyards there, and then how, I guess let's start with Pinot Noir, because I want to hear more about the Chardonnay as well. But for the Pinot Noir, you have the Beaux Frères vineyard is 35 years old. You have a couple others that were planted, and then you guys have a handful of clones for each. Have you guys progressed over the years leaning towards different clones, or is it based on the site? And can you give us a little bit of insight of where each vineyard is and how they're different?
Sure. If we need to talk about mono selection of a single genetic type, which has been the vast majority of the last 50 years of wine growing in the Willamette Valley, its entire history, just about. The biggest thing to define the expression, besides the site and the cultural practice, is vine age, I would say. Younger vines express the genetic makeup, assuming it's a single type, much more. As the vine ages, the profile that it expresses changes. So in this infancy of our industry, there's so many things that can make it hard to understand expression of wine. I've just, in a recent stretch of years, 7 or 8 years ago, we started a nursery project to initiate the concept of mixed genetic types together with the selection of those, the pool of applicants coming from traits that we found the most desirable for us in our vineyard, in our oldest section of our vineyard, just by selecting donor vines from our own rooted original plantings that my dad put in when I was a year old, of 3 different clones originally: Pomard, Vadensville, and Charles Coury. The expression at which we started marking and collecting genetic material from these vines, the age being a little older, the expression being much less of the original clonal makeup, is what the French have been doing for many years. So the Burgundians, for sure. And I think there's no new idea under the sun. I was inspired by this way to think about the plant material that we use. So we've been changing the genetic kind of way of thinking of plant material for our replacement and new vineyard that we planted. And for the rest of our property, it's a beautiful expression of the mantra that my dad started on grafted material, because we don't need to replant it. We just watch it age beautifully. And I think that vine age can be really promising in Oregon in terms of longevity. I think that with good farming and with the type of climate that the Willamette Valley can give, it's changing, yes, but it's not changing nearly as violently and as dangerously as some of the other growing regions in the world. I think that's why Burgundy and some European countries are very interested in Oregon, is because it's buffered a little from climate change. And so the current era of Beaux Frères and the expression of our wines is the expression of, for our Upper Terrace vineyard, it's 9 acres of Dijon clone, 100% Dijon clone, planted in 1999, so they're 24-year-old vines now. Beautiful expression point for a vine age being just out of adolescence. It's really like a human. They peak at 40 years. If you talk to Burgundians, average vine age of 40-ish years is like the sweet spot. You don't want too much old vine, because they're a little more geriatric in profile. They have less perception of primary fruit and maybe just a little austere. Young vines are like brutes. They want to show everything they can get, and the profile of fruit is too aggressive. So the Beaux Frères vineyard, half of it was planted own-rooted, old vine. 3/4 of that half has now been replanted to my Massal program that I started. So rebirthing the genetic material onto grafted phylloxera-resistant rootstock. And so that half of the original Beaux Frères vineyard is now at a big inflection point. Most of the vine age is a lot younger. The vine age of the other half is an average of 24 years, and it's a beautiful expression that is in a point of maturity, beautiful maturity. And then we planted. I'm so sorry to digress into too much, but we planted an additional vineyard that is coming online 100% from our Massal program, from the old vines. It's bore its fourth leaf last year, so it's gotten its second small harvest. Young vines during warm vintages. We're still understanding the terroir of this new site and where it will lead us and what it will tell us. But stay tuned.
Awesome.
Yeah.
No, I was actually, Brady's going to have to ask the non-wine nerdy. I was actually going to go deeper and just ask you quickly about, you don't have to say the exact name of the rootstock, but when you did graft with your Massal selections, did you try to optimize for something? Are these like nematode resistant? Or are you trying to have lower vigor? What was the goal when you did decide to graft, since everything was naturally ungrafted before?
Sure. So besides phylloxera, which is a pest that will destroy any vineyard that has a soil type that is not very sandy and without much clay, disease and pests are we have it pretty easy in the Willamette Valley. We have topical issues on the fruit due to relatively higher humidity. We make treatments to control powdery mildew and botrytis on an annual basis, but not endemic or systemic pests. We don't choose rootstocks for that purpose, really. We just we are forced, sadly, to need to use this interface between the soil and the final fruit. It's sad because it's a Frankenstein kind of genetic choreographing of things that we'd rather have natural. But vines are very tenacious plants, and they will adapt very beautifully. The rootstock selection is based on, therefore, not necessarily a disease mindset. There's some considerations for drought resistance, but really, I don't find it to be a major player, but it is probably number 2. And the number 1 choice for rootstock, which we're not diversifying hugely, is just, for us, the selective use, depending on a few slopes that we like, of the rootstock Riparian Blois, which is very devigorizing, and it shows a profile in the ripening that is, for me, just a nice component. It ripens a little sooner, and you would think that'd be a terrible idea for global kind of generally warming climates. But even in warmer vintages, the RG block that my dad planted in Dynamite block, for example, on the top of the hill, it's the first pick, yes, but it's a very red and beautifully primary profile that just, it works well. And one other rootstock makes up 75%, 80% of the current kind of makeup, 3309, and there's 10114, which is the other number 2, I would say, popular rootstock. But they're largely, for us, there's not a huge consideration factor. There's a lot more scrutinization of rootstock selection in Burgundy because of the endemic issues of trunk disease and virus, but mainly Botrytis varians and Eutypa. And there's a beautiful new wave of pruning, and the way that the philosophy of pruning a vine and the selection of suckering or deep disbudding that can set up an architecture of the plant that will help with keeping trunk disease at bay. But I could go way off onto this stuff, and I will try to keep it a little simpler if you guys would like.
I'll let Brady hop in here. We may have to go back to the pruning because we were just talking to Peter Sisek about his updates at Pingus, and it's something that I'm really into. But we'll switch gears for here. Then maybe when we get into the biodynamics, we can talk about some of the pruning techniques.
Maybe part of that we can talk about each, like your estate vineyards. And was it Upper Terrace that you'd most recently put in? Do you have?
No, that was the second wave right in the middle of the Beaux Frères history.
That was in 2000, right?
Yeah.
99.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we can walk through your estate vineyards there. And I don't know if you have different, as you get into pruning, I'm sure you have maybe some different approaches depending on the plot, but maybe we can talk through that.
And the Bridge Vineyard too, that you just mentioned, was planted like last 2 years ago? Was the combining?
2021. Yeah.
Okay.
Was that this Bridge Vineyard that we're currently calling it, but we haven't determined what it's going to what it wants to be called on an official basis, but it bridges our swath of forests beautifully, and that's what we currently think about it. It's either that or Fernandez, the Fernandez family. We bought the property from it. It's been known as the Fernandez property since my childhood, but we have this beautiful swath, right? And it's the majority of our 300-ish acres is forested. Perimeter of all of our I'm going to say 4 family estate vineyards. The fourth or the third in historical chronology is my father's retirement vineyard. He calls it Sequitur, which is adjacent to the Upper Terrace vineyard. It shares the same access roads and everything, but the Bridge Vineyard was the latest development that I've developed on my own. My father was certainly there barking at me for not terracing the steepest section, and we fought this beautiful battle, and I told him I'm making my decision, and I did not terrace it. I planted straight up the 30% slope, and I told him we got the equipment now that will not compact the soil and will farm. Anyways, I digress.
That's what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear more about how the farming over time has changed as you've looked to put your stamp on it and how things have evolved.
Sure.
So you were getting into that was actually just what I was in.
Farming is the one thing that has not changed to an extent that my father and I together, I think, realized an adaptation is needed for the changing climate, for the vine age. The vineyards have aged. The farming changes with that. For some of our vineyards, with the advent of phylloxera, the late 90s was the birth year of, or the birthing era of our biodynamic program. My father, he's always been a spiritual individual, and I feel like his touch with reality is based on his sensitivity to subtle influences. And I grew up being forced to go to church, and I hated it. And I wish I wasn't. I wish I wouldn't have been forced, or the church. I wish that this rural church would have been maybe more engaging to youth. But he switched in this time period that when he started seeing phylloxera affecting the vines, to foster this. Madame Bislois was at the time pretty confident at that point about what biodynamic farming can contribute to a lot of things, not just the quality of your wine, but a general ethos that's really just good. Okay. And so he realized that phylloxera is like AIDS. You're going to die from it eventually, but I'm going to think differently about how we're farming and think about this beautiful digestive system that is the soil, and foster the most healthy soil we can achieve to promote health of our byproduct, the vines that are coming out of it. And we're gonna elongate and preserve our older unrooted vineyard, and in general all throughout the property after we trialed it to convert to biodynamic and holistically or permaculturally minded farming. I've always stood behind him But as I was forced, when I wanted to achieve a material item, my father told me I needed to work. And as I was stirring these preparations in my youth and burning my shoulders and looking at this homeopathic solution that is hocus pocus, it's hocus pocus. I can't touch it and see it. I can't make experiments that rule out all the confounding variables. I don't subscribe to some of the components that are too homeopathic, that are too hard to see net results. So my father in his secular vineyard, he's applying his hocus pocus, and it's not owned by Beaux Frères actually. And it's a beautiful melange of our two worlds now, where I get to do what I think is best. And we have a robust compost program, a facility that we make our own compost. We promote floor till and health just the same as we always have. But I'm currently not dynamizing preps. I am sometimes dynamizing solutions that are not homeopathic, meaning I don't take 50 grams of silica, dynamize it in 100 gallons, and spray it to 30 acres, which is about that's like a tenth of a milliliter of water for every few plants. I don't do that. I increase the percentages. I use some of the theories that were put in place, and I adapt it. I think that's what Mr. Steiner was always. It's an interpretation of some really interesting, subtle influences, not some dogma that we need to follow a recipe for. Oh, that was too much, perhaps. No? Okay. So farming now is just an adaptation to the changing climate. We have experienced some unprecedented extremes, certainly, with one vintage of wildfire smoke impacted grapes, which we decided to completely not produce any estate wine. We harvested one block, two barrels of wine prior to the smoke of the RG block that I was mentioning earlier. And we bulked out the rest of our wine because of that truly unique scenario of a wind event that coupled with an inversion that was bookended with a long drought. But that's not gonna be a unique event in the next 20 years. We're gonna probably get another smoke vintage, I think, and there's nothing we can do about it. And we had an unprecedented frost event, one in the last 50 years in 2022. And it was beautiful to see the result being not nearly as devastating as the average frost event in Burgundy, for example, in the last 10 years. Like it was beautiful to see the vines rebound out of a frost event.
That's awesome. That's really great detail. I want to move from the vineyards maybe into the winery a little bit. Something that
Sure.
Billy and I have talked about in the past is just like really enjoying, for instance, like whole cluster fermentation and use of being able to pull those levers. Obviously, your barrel aging program, neutral, and other kinds of oak that you might use, and at what percentages. Maybe you can talk about some of your favorite levers to pull in the winery, and maybe something unique that you guys maybe do or don't care about that others do that you think makes a difference.
Sure. Yeah. The Beaux Frères history of vinification, I keep on bringing topics back to vine age. I try not to too much, but my father started making the early days of Beaux Frères based on what Grand Cru producers were doing, the use of, picking decisions, for example, and yield and thinning to a very objective one or even less than one cluster per shoot on this. You should see the energy that comes out of the vines in this climate, in our high density planting, 6 feet by 3 feet, thinning very aggressively in the early days, picking at peak ripeness. And we did have some warm vintages. It was cooler in the 90s, in the earlier part of Beaux Frères' history. There were cool periods, but there were also some warm vintages and picking at peak ripeness. Wow. And using an extraction regimen that was punch down heavy and fairly aggressive on pulling from the material that's in the vat and a fairly long maceration, 21 days, comparative to what we do now. And the use of 100% new Francois Frere heavy toast wood. That was this more or less a formula. And it was interesting it's always so exciting and interesting to taste old vintage Beaux Frères on this young vine program. And there is this structure and intensity and alcohol levels that there's some vintages that are actually showing really beautifully still, coming into its own with this massive structure that they started with, lower acid also. So vinification, it took an inflection point in the late 90s with the decreasing of the use of new oak, still using fairly within the new realm. There was maybe from 100, we went down to 50 or something, or 40% new oak in the late 90s or early 2000s.
Did you change the toast level too?
And the toast levels we've learned, and forest types certainly have also forest selections and Cooper diversification.
Someone else that we were talking to was mentioning like forest selection, wood types, Coopers, all that. Had never even really considered those as levers to pull outside of, barrel age, toast level, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That's really, cool and granular.
Yeah. I like to think now maybe a little less in terms of levers to pull as just a way to translate the vineyard. It's a translation, and the accent of that translation or the dialect shouldn't change from generation of winemaker too much. It changes a little, certainly, but now, and that in my father in his youth and in his expression wanted to express. Also, the clonal material and the vine age wanted to do that. I think it's a cool natural evolution to pull that back a little as the vine ages and expresses a little more complexity. And so there's interesting forest types. Yeah, Jura is a new one that I'm interested in, and Juppy or the Vosges, the classic Vosges or Tronchet forests are also very tight grained and lean, but are they right or wrong depending on a cold vintage and a warm vintage? I like to have two different programs of oak use. Not drastic at all. We're now using 20% to 30% new French oak. The remaining percentage of oak is 2 to 5 years old. We're using amphora, terracotta. We're using sandstone a little bit. We're seeing some interesting things out of vessels that don't add a direct chemical imposition on the wine like oak sugar does. And the porosity of different vessels is very interesting. And it's almost a tool in just helping us learn as much of it is an interesting component within our single vineyard bottlings. But vinifications have evolved to a point where now we're extracting much less. We're intentionally pulling much less out of the skins and seeds, in particular seeds. We're using less extraction treatments per day, 1 per day mostly. And we are using less time in the vat on the skins. Maceration times went from 21 to 14 to 16. And we're picking the grapes earlier. We are also looking at the combination of these earlier picks on warm vintages with similar yield thinning control measures. When we do, there's research, our own Oregon State University Viticulture and Enology department has proven that sticking to this Grand Cru template of 2.5 tons to the acre, it is not benefiting for the balance of the vine, for the power of the vine that wants to put out. And it will decrease quality. It can, if you restrict yields too low. And I agree with that, but I also am just looking at interesting levers, maybe as you say, to realize that in academia, there's a point where you need to research to make your experiment valid. You have to pick a little later. I think picking earlier and it's a gamble because when you make thinning decisions before you know what the final ripening window will be like. But with some instances, I've seen the retention of this red profile that is so much speaking to what Pinot Noir I feel is when it's great. When you control yields to an extent and you, on a warm vintage, you choose the point where you want to end up on the profile of fruit spectrum on a red, it pairs very beautifully, and it has this energy, and acid retention obviously is there. We're not making super low acid wines like we were in, and adding acid in the vat, of course, to make up for some of that. But we have this freshness, this aging potential based on this current way of thinking about ripening and translation of the fruit to the, and it's based on what we do in the cellar with less. Yes, minimalism in the vinification.
Cool.
And separating press fractions as well is a new component, and using it as a tool, which is quite great for the winemaker to be able to use a tool to pull certain press lots out to show a more primary and rich expression of the wine. And we choose to put that into our Willamette Valley labeling, which is our entry level. And it's a selection that's very direct, and it's a selection that's expressing the general idea of the Willamette Valley region. And it's simpler and fun, and I love the wine, and it shows itself very easily, and it's what an entry-level wine should, I think, be. Okay.
Very cool.
And we age our wines for not an intensely long period in the barrel. We're 10 to 12 months in barrel, a couple months in stainless. We're unfined and unfiltered. I think the removal of the soul can be achieved of a wine if you filter it and fine it to an extent. Fining is interesting, though. There's things in Chardonnay that could be justified. If you take the time, the patience that's needed to settle a wine in a vat, in a fermentation vat, post-maceration first, and then second when you're removing it from barrel to let it rest in a closed stainless environment for a period, then I think filtration is not expressing what all the beautiful microbiome and life that the vineyard gave us.
For sure. The more I don't make wine, obviously, but the more I study it for my MW stuff, I'm like, well, if you have the time and you had a good nutrient-rich ferment, then you might as well just let it settle. I had a question on, so I guess you guys are doing fewer punch downs, if any, or are you guys doing pump overs now? And then when you're choosing these alternative vessels here, are they all the same shape and you're just changing based on like the oxygen transmission, or are some in amphora, Vevri type form and some are eggs, or like what is the situation there?
Well, what maybe your question is why, and does shape, why are we experimenting with vessels, and is the shape?
No, I think it was more just the oxygen component. Is that the biggest consideration when you're testing with these new things?
It's hard to pull out individual things when you look at the complexities of vintage variation, but I'll just, I guess, generalize a little bit. Both, I would say that the porosity, yes, is some of the most impactful components of some of the changes we're making to a small percentage of our wine, both in the fermentation vessel and in the aging vessel. That it's, the rate and the way that it's oxidizing and interacting with its environment outside of the aging vessel, that it is really interesting to see how it evolves the wine in this particular way. More porous vessels are more porous for a terracotta. We choose to select some of our most brooding and hedonistic plots, and usually it's a clonal imposition of 943 clone, or some of the California heirloom clones that we can have. We have in certain plots, they have this structure, this primary and dark structure that when placed in terracotta, it softens it in a way and almost corrupts it in a way that makes it really interesting. And a lot of times it may be coming into play as a chemical imposition, this perception of iron and blood, like a Sangiovese. It's pretty interesting. And when you put a very elegant lot in terracotta and amphora, it corrupts it too much and it evolves it too fast, and it doesn't have the structure to hold that kind of oxidative input. And it's also it does exchange ionically and reduces the pH, increases the pH, it reduces the acidity to an extent, especially when they're new vessels.
Mike, when we went up to taste, I think we haven't got to talk too much about the Chardonnay, which I really wanted to do, and we're coming up to time. but
Sure.
we went up to taste it, like really was blown away by the Chardonnay and just how it's evolved in the region as a whole. But your guys and some of your peers that we had were just like, yeah, I was just totally taken aback by the quality that things have gotten to there. Do you feel like is that sort of a central focus over the next decade? And what does that market look like? Is it just in the last couple of minutes here? Can you talk about what is the future of Chardonnay at Beaux Frères and in the Willamette Valley generally?
Sure. So in the North Willamette Valley, there's some interesting components, things happening with Chardonnay, and it's a very different expression than I would say the Willamette Hills is where there's some of the most proud, rousing producers and expressions of Chardonnay being made. I would credit happily some of that realization and birthing of Chardonnay's current appreciation and noise that it's making was due to Dominique Left's contributions and coming into the Willamette Valley, starting Evening Land Vineyards and spreading some of the kind of translation of the terroir that we have with his understanding was pretty helpful for us as an industry. And in the North Willamette Valley, it's a climate that's, I think, a little more expressive of vintage. When it's warmer, it's a little warmer. And when it's cooler, well, it could be in between. It depends on some of the final ripening conditions. But as it relates to Chardonnay, in our little estate, we have not had tenure. We have 400 vines that were decided by my father to not rip out of the vineyard. They were accidental. How do you say it? The nursery sent us some Chardonnay vines in the early plantings, and my dad liked co-fermenting them with Pinot Noir. And so we piloted Beaux Frères Chardonnay 10, 15 years ago. We started doing it with these rogue vines, we call them. And we started to understand with vine age that there is a very beautiful profile present and available. When we selectively harvest these 400 vines, we have an Easter egg hunt every vintage to start with our home team. And we pull it's one barrel of Chardonnay we've been making and learning the biggest component on what is Chardonnay at Beaux Frères through these, who knows what clonal material, rogue vines. And we've come to the realization that with very careful considerations and realizations that it's not Yosemite Hills Chardonnay, but it is equally interesting, that we're going to launch an intentional Chardonnay program with the Bridge Vineyard, which is 16 acres in total. 3.8 of those are a Massal selection of those rogue vines primarily. So that's your answer. Are we centralizing our focus on Chardonnay? No. I guess we're admitting that we might have enough distractibility to still maintain Beaux Frères as being a leader in translating Pinot Noir. We're a Pinot Noir house. But there's some very interesting things that we can show with Chardonnay, we think, and it won't distract us. It'll actually help us understand, I think, this distinction between white and red winemaking. We have a winemaker, Damien Lapoyade. He came from Evening Land. I convinced him to join me, and I'm very pleased that he decided to come with us on doing a few things here when he came, making a significant winery renovation to have a state-of-the-art facility be at our usage so that we can focus on the intimacy that is needed to make wine and not the logistics of making wine, and to spearhead an intentional Chardonnay program that is, people can maybe acquire it out versus the 25 cases we've been producing annually at the estate Chardonnay. So it's really exciting in that regard. There's some things that are saddening to see, but I'm very excited for the change. We're removing our vineyard barn. We're demolishing it, which is attached to the winery, and we're putting the vineyard barn in the vineyard. Now our vineyard team and our winemaking team have to figure out how to be like this, like we are now, because it's so essential to have that, to have the vineyard and winery teams be like breathing the same breath And it's too sad so often to see wine growers that don't have that unison in the teams. But I'll figure it out, I hope.
Describing yourselves as a Pinot Noir house, but wanting to actively be a participant in the moving forward of Chardonnay. I think that's what I took from your answer, and taking all the steps to make sure both of those things happen simultaneously. Yeah, really appreciate it. We're pushing up to time here. I'm glad we got to dig as deep as we did, though, into especially vineyard process and winemaking, because we don't always get to do that. So definitely appreciate you sharing. And hopefully we'll be able to have more conversations. And as you guys do some of those build outs, maybe we can get on again at some point.
It would be my pleasure. And it's a balanced geeking out session with you guys. I would always be up for. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Mike. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay.
That sounds good. Thank you guys for listening.
All right. That was our full interview with Mikey Etzel. If you want even more info with him, check out our 5 Questions with a Winemaker episode, where he shares a lot of the same information that he shared, but also some other tidbits that you might not have gotten in this episode. And for now, that is our episode for this week. Stay tuned for another 5 Questions with a Winemaker coming out this Friday, and another full episode next week. Cheers.